All right, we will go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. We're here to talk about the city's proposal for a shared micromobility pilot program with the goal of increasing mobility options in that G-line corridor. So John, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Adam. Yes, hi, I'm John Ferruzzi. I'm the manager of the Mobility Division of Arvada Public Works. And tonight we're going to be talking about several items related to micromobility. We'll go over some background information. We'll discuss first and last mile connectivity to the G-line stations in Arvada. And from there, we'll discuss micromobility and a pilot project plan that we would like to share with you. And at the very end, we'll have a Q&A. So please use the Q&A function to submit your questions as we go through this process. Yes, so I'm John Ferruzzi, and with me here, I have Adam Lind. Adam is our bicycle and pedestrian coordinator. The project also includes our parking and transportation demand management coordinator, Derek Fern. So to provide you with a little background about the project, we started on this topic with the Citizens Transportation Advisory Committee back in 2019. And this is in relationship to the opening of the G-line stations and the G-line service. At that time, especially with the parking impacts at some of the station areas, there was a question about first and last mile connectivity, where, for example, if folks are, within proximity to a G-line station, would it be possible to have better connectivity and options for them, therefore leaving room and space for parking at the station for others beyond that 1 mile area where the transit service is located. And from there, the Transportation Committee explored a number of options and discussed basically the most feasible options as to recommend a priority to City Council. That information was provided in January 2020, and from there we basically were on the path of exploring a first and last mile project that included micromobility and as well as the traffic calming project. So tonight we'll be talking about the micromobility portion of this. And the specifics of that recommendation from January 2020 is that we would focus on a 1 mile radius of the G-line stations, that we would encourage private sector micromobility programs. So this wouldn't be an added burden to the city in terms of tax dollars and so on and so forth. And then that we would start with an approach that included some improvements to the existing bicycle and pedestrian facilities as a traffic calming safety program within the neighborhoods, because in addition to the G-line stations and the traffic that they generate, the adjacent neighborhoods and streets are impacted. So kind of a two-pronged approach: provide connectivity, increase safety. And then from there, we had discussions with a number of companies and had them present information to the Transportation Committee about how they charge and what their apps look like. And from a city perspective, we opted to recommend that we would regulate the companies with a fee and permit structure to make sure that we're holding the companies to a process that is fair and wouldn't add an extra layer of burden or cost or impact another part of our public works programs. In terms of the pilot project and the project as a whole, we also intend to collect data, report on the performance, and look at this as a service to the public and make sure that the companies are being equitable with their approach with how they would approach micromobility. So to provide you with a graphic, kind of an overview of what a mile looks like around the G-line stations, you can see here on the map, we have all 4 stations, including the very last station along the G-line, which is technically in Wheat Ridge, but serves Arvada, listed. We are working with our neighboring jurisdictions like Wheat Ridge, like Westminster, Denver, Jefferson County, and Adams County on coordination related to the micromobility devices and the program that we're piloting. However, our area of control is really within our own jurisdiction, the city of Arvada, and therefore the focus is connectivity, and we're looking at the streets and improvements within the city of Arvada jurisdictional boundary. So as you notice with the red line, with the red circles on the map, we're essentially proposing a service area that represents a 1 mile radius from the G line stations, and coordinating with our neighboring jurisdictions on the potential to expand that service into the other jurisdictions. The 1 mile area is important because in terms of walkability, if you're on the edge of 1 mile, it's a 20-minute walk. And if you're on your bicycle or if you're on a scooter, it's about 5 minutes or less. And the idea here is that when you have essentially these kinds of devices, it then makes transit and multimodal transportation competitive with driving, and so less time is needed to get around. And as a result, that's the reason for the 1 mile area. It's also worth noting that the parking impacts to the stations are reduced as well, allowing us to more efficiently bring more people to transit. One of the other things to note here is that there are fewer bus routes in the service area, and they mainly serve the major roads like our arterials with low frequency. And this is kind of a process that RTD has developed based on spreading service across the Denver metro area, and where demand is highest is where they focus their bus service. So our bus service is has the highest demand on Sheridan, on 58th, on Wadsworth, and Kipling. And therefore, these are the areas that have service, but all the other streets in the 1 mile radius do not have the same kind of bus connectivity and service. So the micromobility is an option that, again, we've been talking about with the Transportation Committee. And to provide you with kind of a history of our region with micromobility, it started back in 2008. This is where B-Cycle launched its bike share program in Denver. And although they haven't been in Arvada, obviously the service and shared mobility devices were introduced to Denver metro area at that time. And then as of May 2018, e-scooters and e-bikes appear in Denver. These are obviously dockless devices that you've probably seen in various neighborhoods. And about a year later, about a month later, Denver caught up to the devices and created a pilot project and program to manage them. About a year later, Aurora set its rules and regulations related to micromobility. And at that time, also, the Colorado legislature passed a bill allowing e-scooters to operate on roadways. And so this is where regulations is catching up to these devices and how they're deployed and their lessons learned, and things are getting a little bit more firmed up as they move along. In September 2019, Lakewood set its rules and regulations, and in April 2020, staff from the city of Arvada provided a workshop on the topic and presented the information on Arvada's version of rules and regulations to city council and how to manage micromobility. So since then, in September 2020, we've established a Speak Up Arvada webpage. If you haven't been to this is where we're publishing a lot of our information related to our projects, including this project, and we are posting surveys and allowing for feedback from the public. In addition to that, we're also holding public meetings. So just like this one, we have 4 meetings in total to provide information about the process. And it's worth noting that we have been going through the process of a Parks Department and trails related e-mobility and e-bike discussion as well. From there, in January 2021, City Council had a workshop on electric devices on trails, and we had a public meeting in February 2021 on this topic. And now we're having besides privately owned e-mobility devices, we're having this discussion with the public and City Council about shared micromobility devices that are provided by companies for lease. So with that, we're basically getting into a number of items that we're going to discuss with you, kind of the same information we've shared with City Council, and we're looking for feedback after we provided this information. We will be covering the following topics. What is micromobility? Why would we want it? What does a pilot project look like? Will it operate, and how will it be regulated? And then what is the process for community engagement and the process for shared micromobility in general? And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Adam.
Thanks, John. So to touch on what micromobility is, I think a lot of people have seen these scooters, but micromobility isn't just these scooters. It's traditional bike sharing, like John mentioned, the old B-cycle system, dockless bike sharing. So not only these scooters, but the red jump bikes or green line bikes or something that's similar, but as a bicycle versus scooter, e-scooters, and then other small personal mobility devices. So technically, if you have your own scooter, it kind of all falls into that micromobility sphere. But here in Arvada, when we're specifically talking about this program and shared micromobility, what we're talking about is dockless bike sharing and dockless e-scooters. And so that's what we'll be focusing on with this presentation today. So for us as the city, as we looked at these options and why, thinking about why we would want shared micromobility, for the user, the main benefit is that it's on demand 24/7 and that it's point-to-point transportation. So our system would operate round the clock. So if you were an employee who needed to get to work early in the morning, you got off late at night, these would be available. Whereas transit kind of has set hours that are ending earlier now, especially during COVID. The transit service tends to lighten up late at night, and so you have to have longer waits. Whereas these options will be available at all times. And you get to go point to point. So wherever you can find a scooter, you can drop it off at your end destination. Some of the old systems, you would have to find a station to put your bike or scooter in and then have to walk. And if there's not one near where you live, then you don't get to kind of complete your trip, or you have to link separate trips together. It's relatively low cost. I think they're about $1 to start up and then maybe 30 cents per mile. So it's relatively low cost and easy to use, in that you can just get on a bicycle or a scooter, use your app to initiate it, and then you're on your way. So that's really on the user side, how we see residents and visitors benefiting. For the city, when we're looking at trying to solve this first and last mile connection issue, scooters and bikes have a low impact to city infrastructure. They're not heavy, they don't damage roads, they don't damage sidewalks, they're not going to damage the asphalt or concrete. So it's not going to add an additional burden in that respect. The city isn't paying these companies to operate. We're not paying for the bikes or the scooters. So there's not any cost to the city in that respect either. The city will generate some minor revenue from fees and permits, and that money will be used specifically to cover related investments such as bike and scooter parking, which we'll touch on later in this presentation. And as we mentioned, it also provides a solution to that last mile transit connectivity issue. So next I want to talk about the pilot project, rules and regulations, operations, funding, and then talk about public input, feedback, and data requirements. So the city is planning to allow a maximum of 2 companies to operate in the city during this pilot project period. The vendors will submit applications and the city will score them and select the 2 vendors that meet and exceed the city criteria. And those vendors will be operating under a revocable permit. So they'll have to basically follow the rules that we set up for this program. And if they're not following them, if they're not maintaining the scooters and bikes, they're not resetting them, then the city has the right to pull their permit and they no longer have the ability to operate within the city. And at that point, if they wanted to come back and operate again, they would have to present a plan and tell us how they're solving all the issues that they had and that they didn't take care of in the first go around. The pilot project will allow each company to deploy up to 200 devices total and 100 bikes and 100 scooters each. So 400 devices total max. We might not reach that point. We might start lower, or the companies might start lower and then kind of build up if they're having success. But this is really to make sure that we don't have the issues that a lot of cities had when these programs started, where there was just hundreds and thousands of devices dumped all over the place. These companies will be required to use technology to limit their service area to a 1 mile radius, which we'll touch on next and exactly show those borders. And then, as John mentioned, we're coordinating with our neighboring jurisdictions about how to handle potential spillover of devices outside of our program boundaries. So as John mentioned, this kind of shows that 1 mile range just as circles, which doesn't really take into account natural boundaries, neighborhoods, streets, destinations, etc. So from there, we've developed this red line, which is our proposed border for the pilot program. So mostly in line with that 1 mile radius. And then we try to look at what the next collector street up was that made sense to cut the border off at. So this area in red is roughly 7 square miles. So it's about 4 miles across, and then you've got 1 to 2 miles north to south, just depending on the area here. And so this is where we would allow scooters to operate. And if you were within this boundary outside of Old Town, they'll have some special rules. The device's electric assist would work and you'd be allowed to park. As soon as you go outside of this boundary, you're not allowed to park. And if you try it, it basically tells you can't end your trip and you have to bring the device back into this area to park and end your trip. And so that's kind of how the technology helps us keep these devices where we want them. And so as I mentioned, around Old Town and the new pedestrian mall area, it's likely we'll have the electric assist turn off so that people aren't zipping through that area where there's a heavy pedestrian usage. The hours of operation, again, are going to be 24/7, and that the devices will only be allowed to park within the city of Arvada. We are working with the city of Wheat Ridge to see if they're accepting of letting devices park at that G-line station. We could kind of adjust our boundary, but not without coordination and approval from Wheat Ridge. So in terms of where these devices are okay to use, sidewalks in Old Town, it would be prohibited. There's too many pedestrians. Bike lanes is really where we're going to encourage people to use them when available. And then sidewalks and trails, if bikes are permitted, then scooters and these devices would be permitted. So in the city of Arvada, bikes are allowed on all sidewalks unless explicitly prohibited, which is mainly around Old Town. And city council is in the process, as John mentioned, of adopting an ordinance that would allow these devices on trails within the pilot project zone. And so we went through that public outreach process to gather feedback and see where people were landing, because those trails really are a main backbone of the bike and non-motorized transportation network. And so it's really crucial to know whether people are going to be allowed on those trails or not. And as of now, the plan is yes, to allow those on trails. So to talk a little bit about our ideas for permitting and fees, the fees would be split and the permits between an annual fee and fees related to fleet size. So there's kind of a cost for the city to spend our time and energy managing the program. And then we're anticipating an additional fee, again, tied to the number of devices. So the more devices there are, kind of the more staff time and responsibility we're going to have to maintain and manage this program, make sure the companies are operating and following the rules and regulations as they should. So there'll be an additional kind of fee tied into that. And lastly, we are also going to kind of have a maintenance fee that only gets used if the companies are not maintaining their devices, if they're not moving them when they need to, if they need to kind of be impounded, and then they would have to pay to get those back out. So the fees, in addition to covering staff time, is really focused to provide an additional infrastructure such as bike racks and designated parking areas, which we'll touch on next, and then potentially support other infrastructure and changes to city streets to make bike riding and scooter riding more comfortable. Example, if there was somewhere that we had space to add a bike lane or a protected bike lane, the fees could be used towards that. So we are well aware that parking is one of the biggest concerns about this program, and we're hoping that we've learned from other cities that have kind of gotten this wrong when they were dumped on their streets, and the steps they've taken to kind of right those issues. So what you can see here is a variety of bike, scooter, parking corrals that are used either on the road in kind of this no man's land where it's close to the intersection that cars can't park, where there's not enough space for that, and designating areas where these devices can be parked. So it won't be required to park in these areas because they won't exist everywhere, but we are looking to add these into high volume destinations where we have space and the ability. So this is kind of one of our big first steps before the program launches, if we move forward, is to get these set up in those areas. So in terms of additional information about managing parking, parking will be allowed on wide sidewalks where at least 4 feet of space can remain. So a lot of the older sidewalks in the city that are only about 3 or 3.5 feet, you won't be allowed to park there. And users have to take a picture of their parked device to end the trip. And so that kind of gives us a way to, and the companies to say, yes, this is parked correctly, you can leave it here, and no, this isn't in the right place, try again. We are anticipating allowing people to park kind of in the gutter pan area. So not really blocking parking spaces, but not blocking the sidewalk either. And also on hardscaped areas between the roadway and the sidewalk. So if there's kind of a tree well or kind of this open area where people get out of their cars that is paved, has bricks, but isn't on top of a tree, that you would be allowed to park a device there, obviously at bike racks and our designated parking areas, and not allowed to park on grass or natural surfaces where trees are, grass is growing, planting, anything like that will be not allowed. So as we mentioned, the companies operating in the city will be operating under a permit, and they'll need to follow the rules and regulations, and those permits can be revoked and service suspended if they're not meeting the city's standards. The companies will be required to have staff in Arvada to respond and to proactively review and relocate bikes and scooters, respond to complaints in a timely manner, and really make sure that the system is operating as expected. The scooters and the bikes all have local company contact info on them, and in addition in the app. So if there are issues, there's a way to contact, the company. The city has also set up this new email address at e-mobility@arvada.org, where people can send in complaints, issues, questions, support, whatever they're thinking about the program or any specific site issues they're having. And of course, the city's phone number will be available to route complaints to and other issues. So in terms of the pilot project and kind of how we anticipate this working, the 2 vendors will be required to submit reports to the city, likely monthly, about the number of trips, the geodata on the trip locations, length and time, and that way we can see where people are using it or not using it. It doesn't include any kind of personal information. All that data has kind of been scrubbed. So it's just trip number 2 was taken from point A to point B for 2 minutes at 5 o'clock at night. And so that way we can kind of say, okay, maybe this person is taking this trip from their work to the train at commute time, and that makes sense. So in addition to this kind of operational data, they're also going to be responsible to provide information about complaints, calls, other issues that have arisen, how they've handled them, response times, and things like that. And so we can really see how our vendors are performing. We anticipate the pilot project will last 6 to 9 months, depending on when the system launches, to include 1 summer period when usage is anticipated to be high. So if we get started kind of in August, then it might end late spring. If we don't get started until spring of next year, then it would probably go through spring, summer, and end in fall. And so we really want to have enough time for everybody to get adjusted, learn how the system works, where they can take the devices, and then see if it's being effective and used in a way that is good and supportive of the city's needs, or if it's not, then we know that as well, and we can adjust the plan and make a decision about moving forward accordingly. So our process to launch is we're in the middle of 4 public engagement events. This is number 3. We've got the online survey and Speak Up Arvada page that a lot of people have already provided feedback on, and that's been extremely helpful. And we'll be kind of analyzing that data and pulling it together to make a report to City Council. If the project does move forward, the selected vendors will be required to do public engagement after procurement, work with residents who want to come out, see how the devices work, learn more about their operations, their specific devices. We'll be working kind of on the administrative side for ordinance adoption, finalizing those rules and regulations and permit structure, and getting the ordinances adopted by City Council. An implementation of preferred parking zones, as we mentioned, where these devices will want people to park them. And then ideally a late summer, early fall launch of this program. So that may work, it may slide and take longer. And we don't want to start in the winter because people aren't really going to use them. The weather's not great. So we want to have a good start to weather to give this program a chance to be successful. So I just wanted to emphasize, as we've had a lot of comments, the city is not paying these scooter or bike share companies any money to operate within the city. They're applying for a permit and going through an application process and being required to pay permit fees to help us operate the system and make the required improvements. So that funding is only going towards direct and indirect program expenses. The city isn't making a lot of money off of this, and we're not paying off of this. We're just trying to set up a system where the private sector can help solve an issue. So in terms of our next steps, when the pilot project timeframe ends, the city will use that available data to make a recommendation to either open the program citywide, or if it's not successful, end the shared micromobility program. So the data that we collect and all the information will be compiled in a report and presentation to City Council, including the trip and usage information, the public feedback during the project, the operator's responsibility and their ability to follow program rules and how that went, whether successful or not, and information about any safety data, crash data, however many trips we're seeing, and how that's actually worked within the city. So as I mentioned, this is our 3rd public meeting. We have one more on Thursday. They've all been the same presentation, so you're welcome to attend one more if you like, but you don't need to. The Speak Up Arvada page is here, and if you're not familiar with that, you can just go to speakup.arvada.org and scroll down that page, and you can find the shared micromobility project and give us your feedback there, and that'll be a way to stay abreast of information related to the public when the next council meeting is, or things along those lines. If you don't want to sign up for Speak Up Arvada, you can just email us your comments, your thoughts about the program, e-mobility@arvada.org. And our public comment period will be open until May 16th, which is a Sunday at midnight. And so that's about a month since we opened the Speak Up page. So with that, I will say thank you again for joining us, and we will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Adam. There was a question in the Q&A portion of our program here. It's the question is, isn't the use of these devices dependent on them being readily available? How will Arvada / the companies encourage use and ensure sufficient supply?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the pilot project, I think we can admit our goal is not to make sure that all devices are available at all times. To start with, we want to make sure that we're not overwhelming the city and the residents with unlimited devices. So that's kind of why we've capped the number at 400 as we start. If the program does go up, we'll be developing rules based on kind of number, the metric that's being used is number of rides per device. So, you know, if we say there's one ride per device per day, then that's kind of maybe low. If they get up to maybe 1.5 per day, then we can say, okay, people are using these regularly and maybe we want to add another 50. And as that kind of metric increases, that's letting us know that more devices are being used and they're being used more often. You get up to 2, 3, 4 rides a day. And then that's how we'll kind of maintain our standards for when companies are allowed to increase devices if the program is successful.
Thank you, Adam. The next question is, how will helmet usage be addressed?
So the program is only for people over 16 years old, and there is no law within the city that you have to wear a helmet. So these companies will, part of their outreach, they'll be able to provide information and feedback about where you can get a helmet. You know, we can partner with some of our local bike shops if people want to ride a helmet, but you're not required by law to wear a helmet as an adult on a bike or a scooter. And so you wouldn't be required to as part of this program.
Thank you, Adam. Those are the only 2 questions I had in the Q&A. Oh, another one just came in. It's what methods of enforcement/reporting are planned if devices are misused? For example, speeding, traveling in restricted lanes, damage to parked cars, etc.
So, I mean, I think if there's a damage to a car, then it's similar to a vehicle. They have to follow the same rules of the road. So it would be an insurance claim with the police. If they're riding somewhere on a sidewalk they're not supposed to, then they're in violation of a law, and police can issue them a ticket. So, you know, the police are there. It's their vehicle. They're same as bicycles, same as vehicles. They have to follow the rules of the road. And if a police officer sees them violating a rule, then they have the ability to issue a ticket or a citation.
Thank you, Adam. The next question is, will scooters/bikes be able to go from the Arvada pilot area into existing service areas such as Denver or neighboring communities going through a similar effort?
Yeah, so with Denver, you know, I think that would be allowed. That's a little bit of a different situation where technically both of us would be operating, but that's the only jurisdiction that touches us that has operations. So Wheat Ridge doesn't, Jeffco and Adams County don't, but that's why we're working with them to see how they're handling this situation now with spillover from Denver, and if they don't mind that these devices are operating, as long as, you know, they're picked up at the end of the night by the operators, and they have somebody to call if they have an issue, then we might be adjusting our rules. But Denver is a little bit different of a scenario than the other surrounding jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate that we're definitely reaching out to Adams County, Jefferson County, Wheat Ridge, Westminster, others in the surrounding areas. And if they indicate that they're interested in partnering, then we would basically work them into our pilot project. And similar to the G-Line effort where we collaborated together, we would basically work together on providing these types of multimodal services to provide transportation options for the public. I'm not seeing any additional questions. Maybe we can just give it a minute if anybody's typing.
Otherwise, yeah, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. If you haven't given us your feedback on Speak Up Arvada, please do, or feel free to email us at that e-mobility@arvada.org, and stay tuned for the next steps.
Thanks, Adam. There are no other additional questions at this time, it looks like. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you participating.
Thanks.
Take care.